This is Teacher's Corner from Stenhouse Publishers. I'm Nate Butler. What can we teach kids today that will have utility 10 or 15 years from now? In Thinking Like a Generalist, Angela Kohnen and Wendy Saul propose an approach to information literacy that goes beyond the teaching of discrete, easily outdated skills. Instead, they use activity to help students build identities as curious individuals empowered to ask their own questions and able to navigate their information-filled world in pursuit of credible answers. In this episode of Teacher's Corner, Angela and Wendy discuss what it means to be a generalist, the necessary skills an expert generalist brings, and how to develop generalist thinking in you and your students. Wendy speaks first.
When I look at schools, things feel very contained, but when I look at life, the work that I do to try and find information feels very uncontained and scattered. One of the questions Angela and I have been asking ourselves for probably the last 10 years is, what can we teach kids today that's going to have utility 10 or 15 years from now? Not preparing them for the next grade in school, not even preparing them for high school or college and career, but let's think about what it is that we do as adults that we could help prepare kids to do when they're in 4th or 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th grade.
Well, and I think about, for a long time in schools, we've thought a lot about experts and what practices we can teach kids in different content areas to help them understand the way experts think about things, the way they think about science or history or literary theory or whatever. And or fiction writing or any of these. And we think that's really valuable. Understanding the practices of professional experts is really valuable, and it's well documented that in our society, maybe expertise is undergoing a bit of a siege right now where people are questioning expertise. We really value expertise, but we also notice that you've got all these questions and curiosities in your life that you're not an expert on, and you're never going to be an expert on. And so you need to understand how to access the things that experts know and synthesize them as an everyday citizen, as a parent, as a curious person in the world. So when we started thinking about, well, who's good at that? Who's good at trying to figure out what experts know, but also keeping enough distance from expertise that they can see it crossed fields? It's also pretty well understood that experts can get a little bit siloed and tunnel vision. They know their own field really well, but maybe they're not always thinking about what somebody in the next department over is thinking about. So I think when Wendy and I were on this quest for, so who are generalists, who's good at this, how do they do it? And we started noticing that there are people among us who are really, really good at accessing expertise across a range of fields to answer questions and solve problems in their lives. And we felt like that was kind of missing from the school curriculum.
We had worked for a long number of years with science journalists to learn from them how they go about doing their work, and brought those understandings into schools. I think it would be useful if I could talk concretely. Let's talk about the kid who was interested in titanium necklaces and how it would improve his sports ability. And he looked at expertise in the field, and who did he go to? Well, he went to his particular sports heroes, and a lot of them were wearing these titanium necklaces. And we asked him to look further. And as he began looking at the scientific data on these titanium necklaces, he found they were, he came to believe that it was not worth the money that he was considering spending on this necklace. It's not a huge issue in the way, what should I do about an upcoming cancer treatment? But it really gives kids a sense of agency and helps them bring the non-school world into the school conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think those journalists, what we learned from them, and really kind of picking their brains about how do you go about deciding what's worth writing about once you have a topic, how do you gather information, who do you ask. It was really interesting to talk to them because as a former high school English teacher myself, who's worked a lot with middle and high school teachers on writing projects, sources of information, it's often like a number. The students always want to know, well, how many sources do I need? Do I need 3? Do I need 5? And like a journalist would never say that. Oh, I've got my 3 sources. I'm done with my article. It's how many perspectives do you need to understand this particular issue? And so we started thinking about the kinds of perspectives you bring to an issue. Yes, sports people are great. So are scientists on the titanium necklace issue. When you think about our current situation and pandemic and things being closed, we talk to medical experts, but people who've had COVID-19 are interested, they're important to understand what's the experience of this like, what is the business owner's experience like. So there's never going to be like, oh, you need 2 or you need 4, and 3 of them have to be from books and 2 are from the internet, or, this kind of thing that we artificially often impose in schools. And journalism's really fun because it has to be contemporary in some way. But then when we were looking around for other kinds of generalists, we found that librarians are really great at sort of figuring out where does expertise live, how is it sort of organized and stored, how does one access it. And then I was interested in, and so was Wendy, we love books from, we're both language literacy kind of people. We love books, and thinking about the really fantastic nonfiction books that are out there right now. So we also talk to authors who, whose business is creating books based on topics that are real, but they're not in the dry way that maybe we encounter them sometimes, and how they think about their work and tapping into expertise. All of these fields are different because they have different sort of products they produce, different time frames. People could spend 10 years writing a book. They often will not spend that long if they work for a newspaper. And so all of that kind of plays into how they think about information, how they think about sources. So they're not the same, but they share enough in common that we felt like, oh, this is a thing. This is something we can bring to kids and think
the
about
other
together.
part of this, I think, is that literacy teachers tend to think of their work as coming out of words and coming out of text, but we really came to value numbers and helping kids understand what numbers mean when they're reading an article, what sort of databases people are using, what would be something reasonable to expect in terms of, whatever issue it is that you're looking at, and what really feels like an outlier, what it means to have 10 people you're interviewing versus 1,000 people you're interviewing. I think that it also, numbers also come in as we look at time. And so, for instance, when this virus stuff first came to the fore, everybody was saying, don't wear masks. They're only useful if you have a cold or something of that sort. And I had done my homework and I went around bragging that I knew that nobody needed to wear a mask. And, lo and behold, 2 months later, it turns out that masks are really important. So you can't, one of the things I work to teach kids is that you can't become so enamored of your position that you're unwilling to change it.
That makes me wonder what qualities you found are common to good generalists.
Well, I think what we've discovered, first of all, you have to be curious. So if you want to be a generalist, and we hope that everyone does, you don't just accept the things that you hear or see around you. Things spark curiosity. So when we think about that in schools, this past year I worked with a bunch of teachers, and the students could pursue their own curiosities, and many of them commented that they hadn't been able to do that for years. They were in 8th grade. So just the idea, some of them said, I don't have any questions, and what do I need to do to get an A? But, once we kind of got past that, everybody's got curiosity. So being curious is key. But the second one is the one I think we've already alluded to, which is this idea of having skepticism, not taking everything that you see as gospel, but also being open-minded, flexible, willing to change your mind. So we tried to condense that into this idea of being an open-minded skeptic. We know you can go too far with skepticism, where you just doubt everything forever, because we can always ask a question or find the exception. But when we think about the generalists that we talk to, they understand that nothing, as Wendy's mask story illustrates, is set in stone for all time. What was true at one point in time based on expert consensus may not be true a year from now. So we have to be willing to change our minds. We have to be skeptical. We also have to be flexible in understanding that knowledge is accumulated. And then finally, persistence. We found that these generalists are really proud of the fact that it may take more than a Google search to find an answer to your curiosity, and the first result that you get may not be the best. And they knew how to sort of either knock down the doors to get somebody to talk to them, or find their way around the database to get to the source they needed, but they didn't give up.
They really evidence a lot of agency, and I worry that's something we're not teaching in schools, and a life skill that's of tremendous importance.
Mm-hmm. Beyond just the characteristics, they also have particular knowledge and skills, of course. And I think one thing that we think a lot about when we work with kids is understanding what makes a source a good source of information, knowing where to go and how to go. Many of the people we talk to, they don't just go to Google. They know they know where good sources of information sort of live. And sometimes it's on the internet, sometimes it's not. But they understand, hey, this particular agency does this particular kind of work, and therefore their website may be a good place to go rather than to Google. And so we found and work with kids that depending on your background, the conversations around the dinner table, the people you've been exposed to in your life, you may have a really large sort of Rolodex of good sources of information sort of in your mind, and you may know none. So examples that I think we like to use a lot are the Mayo Clinic. That sounds really funny to kids who've never heard of the Mayo Clinic. It sounds like mayonnaise. And sort of exposing students to these kinds of sources and where information kind of originates and how it gets there. It's an equity issue as well. It's sort of a leveling of the playing field, if you will, for people who are not having conversations like that. CDC is now much more common. Like, we all know the CDC right now, but 4 or 5 years ago, there were a lot of kids who had never heard of the CDC and had no idea of what kind of work they did. And those are just a couple of examples.
And I think that this issue of expertise is an interesting one. We've somehow passed on the message in schools that an expert is somebody who publishes a book or writes an article. We had a kid who wanted to do a project on cars, and it turned out his father was a mechanic. But he said, well, I can't ask him. He just graduated from high school. So it's also about expanding their mental pool of experts.
In the case of the student and his car project, perhaps he didn't fully understand the variety of sources available to him. What are some of the common pitfalls students encounter as they develop an idea or a project?
I think that's the right place to start. I mean, what idea is sort of too big or too small to pursue? If you want to know how many legs a spider has, you don't need multiple credible sources. Everybody's going to tell you the same thing. But if you want to know something like how to cure cancer, it's way, way too big a question. Angela, why don't you talk about our continuum, our two continuums? I think they would be useful for listeners.
I think sometimes in schools we think about many of these issues around like a project or a paper or some sort of outcome. And when I work with teachers, one thing we talk a lot about is their skills that we're talking about, dispositions, habits of mind, pieces of knowledge, and then skills that kind of don't matter what it is you're researching, what you're trying to look into, because they're hopefully transferable. You're learning how to learn, how to be curious, how to dig for information, how to assess sources. So we spend a little bit of time thinking about what kind of topic would make a good topic, how do you, because we're looking for the right sort of fertile ground for you to learn about how to do all these generalist moves and behaviors. And when we think about that, the reason we think it's so important to be able to do this is, first of all, the amount of information that is bombarding us all the time. And a few years ago, Wendy and I started thinking about that as this continuum of information where on the far one end is what we started calling incidental information. And that's that information that's just sort of hitting us constantly. Every time you pick up your phone, there may be a new, feed from some source that you've subscribed to. Your friends may be sending you information. You may log on to social media and you've got all this stuff that you didn't really necessarily ask for.
You're sitting in a car dealership and they're blasting stuff at you.
Exactly. And then on the other end, you've got your intentional information. And that's the information like my daughter asked me a question, I whip out my phone and I deliberately go out to find the answer to a question she had. But in between, there's all this sort of middle ground. Like I deliberately turn on NPR, but I don't know, I subscribe to the Daily, the New York Times morning podcast, but I don't know what they're going to tell me each morning. So that's not exactly intentional. It's not exactly incidental. We kind of have that in this middle ground. When we think about the kinds of skills we need to impart and attitudes we need to impart to students today, I think it's important to kind of think about that because we spend a lot of time in schools sort of focusing on the intentional searches. We're going to do a research paper now. By tomorrow, everybody bring in 3 topic ideas. By the next day, we're going to do this and that. And we're going to teach you how to go out and find information. And a lot of times that incidental information that they're just being hit at, it's like that before class chatter. Did you hear? Did you know? And, you hear it. And as a teacher, you're kind of trying to move into whatever you have planned for the day. And it feels like a distraction. And I think one point we want to make is that stuff's important because a lot of times that is about issues that we've heard kids exchanging very dubious information about STDs, about things that are incredibly important about election fraud, to use like political
and sometimes health issues. Like there was all this thing about kids smoking Smarties. I mean, if we hadn't tuned into that
e-cigarettes, there'd be
never would have thought of that. Pardon?
Yeah. So I think when we think a little bit about why do we need to be generalists, why do these skills matter, one thing to think about is where do we apply these skills? And hopefully we're able to teach kids how to use this kinds of thinking on that incidental information as well. We found that just the simple question of who says, asking when you hear a new piece of information, well, who says that Mountain Dew cures, whatever. Mountain Dew prevents you from getting pregnant. I think that was it. If you drank it the next morning. Who says that? And a quick who says can get you pretty far, So that's one of the frameworks that we use to think about. The other framework that we use to think about our own searches, we have graphed as sort of an XY axis. And across one axis, we think about the preparation or education or background knowledge you might have on a particular topic, going from I have a PhD in this issue to I have literally no knowledge whatsoever. The other continuum goes around the importance that you're attaching to the particular search. Is this incredibly high stakes? Or is this something like it's just a little passing fancy? I wonder about the thing my students are talking about related to Roblox every morning and creating their own game on Roblox. And what is that? Not super important. I'm not well prepared for that, but I'm not going to probably spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. When we think about that continuum, once again, we feel that in our experience, schools spend a lot of time preparing students to be miniature experts, teaching them how to do searches for information as if they had a ton of education and preparation on the topic. When in reality, we think the most important kinds of information seeking that we do as adults fall down on the other end. It's something we don't have a lot of background in, but we find it really high stakes. So should I send my kids to summer camp this summer? I mean, to me, that's an important issue, but I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't know anything about diseases, and I'm trying to gain my footing as best I can. When we put kids in situations where they're looking for information about topics they feel invested in, and that's from their point of view. It's not ours to judge, like, that's not a high stakes topic, you can't look at that. We want them to feel invested in it, to feel like the answer is important. But it also is very often something that they're not well prepared to understand the information they receive. So what do? And we live in an age where there's a lot of things you can do to get yourself up to speed on background knowledge and be ready to deal with the information that you encounter.
One of the sources that we use very often is Wikipedia, and teachers are generally shocked to hear that we think Wikipedia is a good source. It's not an end source, but if you're just looking for a way to navigate a landscape, it's a very good navigational tool. There are a lot of myths going around about Wikipedia that anybody can go in there and just change information. It's just not true. And I think it's useful for a teacher to share with kids how information gets up there. It's all available on the site. And, when I was a kid, the source of information was the encyclopedia. We liked it because it was an edited collection, and people are acting like Wikipedia isn't edited. But I would claim at this point it's not only edited, but its mode of editing is fairly transparent.
It seems like Wikipedia would be a good starting point, as it's so frequently references are listed within there if you scroll to the bottom of that page.
And very often, frankly, Wikipedia is written at a higher level than what most of our students can access. But sometimes it isn't. And we usually say it's a great place to start, not a good place to end.
And one thing we often teach as a first step when you've got an issue, and we model this off of what the generalists we talk to do, is you often have to get the lay of the land. You need to get oriented. So I want to know if we can live on Mars. Well, there's a lot of background knowledge that I may need before I decide if that's like a question that I can just pursue. Is that too big? Is that too small? Where are the sources of information sort of aggregated somewhere? So I may need to do this process called orientation, or getting oriented, getting the lay of the land. And we find that people do this in all kinds of different ways. Often they involve sort of overview background sites like an encyclopedia, like a general article. The Mars issue has been written about a lot lately, so there may be like a background article that exists on some popular magazine. But they also might turn to people, and that's what I think a lot of the generalists I talk to, I think this is something that it sort of surprised me, but it sort of didn't. It's like, oh yeah, we have a network of human beings that I can turn to and say, hey, I'm really interested in this issue. Can you tell me, is this something worth pursuing? How might I go about trying to understand this further? teaching a classroom of kids to sort of rely on one another as a network, that together they can help each other. They may know, we refer to these in the book as guides, finding a guide who can help you sort of understand where you are on the landscape and where you might go next. They're all around us. And they're often very eager to help you out. It's something they know a lot about. So whether it's Wikipedia, reading the background, going down to the sources, whether it's talking to your teacher and getting a little bit of background footing, sometimes textbooks, depending on the topic, can provide you with enough sort of baseline knowledge. But knowing that I need to know something before I can then know more things, I think is a key stage. Well, when I think about this in terms of product and the way I used to teach sort of research papers, we were in such a hurry to get to that thesis statement and get to the 5 sources of information that we often just skipped right past the getting oriented phase. And often the time crunch of schools causes us to just keep pushing kids too quickly, when just take a minute, let them get oriented, and they're going to make a better, they're going to do a better search and find out better information.
I think that our tendency is to say you start with a question, and we believe it's important to get oriented before you ask a question. One of the things that our experts, especially our children's book authors, taught us was that they never start with what their book is going to be about. They all start by what they call reading around or talking around, to see what Deborah Heiligman calls what are the oh wows in that topic. And I think that we often view those oh wows as the icing on the cake rather than as the driver. And we believe that those are the drivers.
It brings me to the idea of what's one thing that a teacher could do to start encouraging this kind of thinking in her students, or perhaps for herself or himself. Is this a skill that can be developed?
We believe it definitely is a skill that can be developed. In terms of,
we work with teachers to show that it really has been developed in a number of kids. It doesn't always develop at the same rate with each kid, but I don't think we've seen any classrooms where it is where these kinds of conversations haven't improved both the thinking of students and the relationships with the teachers.
Yeah. So if we think from sort of a school-based standpoint, what could you do tomorrow? We think about the read aloud, think aloud, and its companion, the search aloud, as being really sort of easy to implement first step for teachers. And these aren't, we have step-by-step instructions in our book. They're not maybe the read alouds that people may be used to. Often when I work with intermediate grade teachers, middle school teachers, they're used to maybe getting a book out and reading it and pointing out the text features and defining the words for students and reading in a particular way. When we think about a read aloud, think aloud to develop sort of generalist dispositions and skills, we encourage people to find an article from a venue that they visit themselves regularly, but maybe they haven't read deeply yet. So you look for a headline, you model sort of, how do I pick something to read? How do I click on it? You're projecting it for the class, and then you're expressing your true questions, curiosities, wonderings as you go. One teacher we worked with thought about how scared she was to mispronounce things in front of her students. And she said, after I started doing this, I realized that, they don't know how to pronounce these words either. And for me to model, like, I'm not sure what that word is. I don't know how to say it. Is it important? Then we'll look it up. If it's not important, I can model how I just sort of move along. As you're asking questions about the text you read, you're modeling curiosity, but you're also modeling, how do I decide which questions to pursue? How do I know when to stop reading this article? And how do I pursue them? So there are technical skills you can model, like opening a new tab and, trying to investigate something while you keep the original article open. These are simple. They can take as little as 5 minutes. We have found teachers, though, get so involved in sort of reading and thinking together with their students that it will become like the Friday thing they do because it's so engaging and useful for their students. I'm going to cough, so I'm going to stop.
We worked with a teacher who saw himself as wanting to set up an experiment. So he had 2 classes, and with one of them, he did these search alouds, read alouds, basically every day, 5 minutes in the beginning of class. And in the other one, he didn't. His original hypothesis was, would this be taking away time from his regular curriculum? And within a couple of months, he said, I need to start doing the read alouds with my other class. The kids came in, they would start talking to him about things that were of interest to him. They came to know him as a person. Their curiosities led them to bring in other articles that they would then share with kids. So his skepticism really turned into not only a love of the strategy, but he made it a ritual. And I think his kids, when they leave his class, might not remember what he had taught them about science, but they will remember how to read.
And I think these can become sources. I've seen teachers where they do these read alouds and they're generating all these questions together. And then you can model. So now we've got this list of questions. Oh, we've got like 3 minutes. You know, everybody knows the dreaded 3 to 5 minutes at the end of class, maybe 7 minutes. You're done with the work for the day. It's too early for everybody to just gather at the door. And you've got this like back pocket list of things. Hey, let's grab a question. Let's try to look into that. Okay, we'll continue that next time. Or let's grab something to read real quick and we'll read together. And we've seen teachers really make great use of these as little sponge activities or mop-up activities that just kind of hang out in the classroom.
One of the things we talk about in the book is how to prepare yourself as a teacher to do this kind of work. And we have all sorts of activities that you'll be encouraged to do that you can then share with your students, because you need to model yourself as a generalist. And I think most good teachers are generalists. I just don't think we share those skills with kids. It hasn't been part of the curriculum.
One thing that can scare teachers off of, and I can sympathize with this, I understand the fear, is getting into territory where you don't know the answer, or you don't know what you're reading, you don't know how to pronounce the word, you don't know where to go for more information. And I think what we found is the teachers who embrace this sort of embrace the learner in themselves, the curious person in themselves. I think we need to keep in mind how overwhelming it must be to be growing up in this kind of information environment, and to be just surrounded all the time by so much information, a lot of it dubious. And if we're not willing to sort of model for our students how we swim through that, how we make sense of it, in our own vulnerabilities. One question that in interviews I've done with generalists and non-generalists alike is, can you talk about a time you've been sort of fooled by something you've encountered online? Everybody's got a story, and it feels sort of you feel vulnerable, you feel embarrassed to talk about the time you forwarded that email that was ridiculous or whatever. But I think if we can come to terms with the fact that it's really hard to navigate today's information environment, and that we're not doing students any favors if we pretend like we always know, and we hide from them all the times more uncertain. I think that that's a valuable thing, which is why we encourage teachers to, in the book and in other venues, we encourage teachers to go through this process themselves, to work on their own skills so that they can sort of figure out, hey, it's okay. We all kind of pursue bad paths sometimes, and what we do when that happens is more important than like never letting that happen.
As I listen to you, Angela, I'm thinking about what we do in schools, and I think that we spend a lot of time trying to teach kids how to be successful in school. And we come up with strategies that will help them answer the questions at the end of a chapter, or strategies that will enable them to succeed on a test. But I don't, and now there's a movement toward college and careers. So we try and teach them what they'll need to know to write the A paper in high school, or how to get into college. But I think what we're trying to do in our book is teach them how to to live as an information seeker in a complex and frankly chaotic world.
Yeah, and I don't think that world is going to get any easier. In fact, I would expect that, 10, 15 years from now, these students are going to be even thicker in information and sources around them.
And so what we all tend to do, what I tend to do is I say, well, Fauci seems to know a lot about the virus. I'm listening to him, as opposed to my neighbor down the street. On the other hand, if I know an epidemiologist and she says this podcast really gets it right, I want to listen to that podcast. So again, I think that guides will become even more important in the future.
How is the book Thinking Like a Generalist set up to develop those skills?
Wendy and I have been talking about this for many years. And then 5 years ago now, I was asked to develop an online class for pre-service teachers on nonfiction writing. And I looked around for a long time for books to sort of help students learn how to teach nonfiction reading and writing. And I didn't find anything great. So I started developing my own materials. And Wendy and I worked together. She was a great sounding board as I did that. And the book, really the structure of the book grows out of that class. So the first section of the book is the underpinnings. What is a generalist? Kind of these basic questions. You see the title. What are you talking about? Why does it matter? So we have all that in the beginning. And then part two, we invite the reader to develop a project of his or her own, starting with generating a topic, coming up with curiosities and questions, and moving through finding sources, deciding what's good and what's bad. And everything in that is based upon activities that my students have done. And every summer there's 40 or 50 students who enroll in that class. So by now, hundreds of students have done this, and they really enjoy it. And when they come out on the other end, we just get all this positive feedback. When I said, I know I've said that students often say we don't get to pursue our own interests within the school day. Pre-service teachers feel the same way. They're like, this is the first time I have thought about a question and really document my process of trying to find an answer and gather different sources and perspectives in ages. They can't even remember the last time they've done it. And through that process, they're also, and within the book, we're also asking you to be metacognitive about it. What moves did you make? What worked? What didn't work? How did you feel when you couldn't find a good source of information? I pushed my pre-service teacher students to go find a real interview and ask some real human beings some questions. In the book, we have a lot of detailed guidance on how to do that. And so by the time the reader of the book is finished with part two, you have a model. You've done it, you can talk about it, and hopefully you're feeling much more grounded in what is it to be a generalist, how do I go about this process, and how might I make this accessible for my students. And then the last part, we have curriculum. We really emphasize, and it was hard for us to make this last part because this is a flexible way of thinking and teaching. It's catered to your students, the time. We wouldn't have been talking about epidemiologists if we did this podcast, 6 months ago. So it's very topical. But we've got a framework for developing units of study and curriculum, and then examples of from real classrooms of that curriculum in action with different topics. We encourage people to swap out your own topic, whatever's really interesting to you and your students. Sometimes some of the units are really grounded directly in state standards and curriculum that must be covered, but the teacher has found a way to sort of spin that into their students' natural curiosities. Other times it's really wide open and it's like, hey, we're going to do this generalist unit and it's going to be centered on what the student wants to learn. So we have that in there for teachers to develop their own.
And, we talk about finding that sweet spot between student interest and the curriculum. And I think a lot of teachers have been able to do that. We had a teacher who was a total baseball fanatic who tied what she was doing to kids' interests in statistics and also business, because she claims that baseball is essentially a business. Another teacher used a nearby trail to as a site for looking at both the history of the area and the ecology. So what we're trying to do is encouraging teachers to help think of ways to bring student interests and their curriculum together.
Thinking Like a Generalist is available now as an ebook from all major retailers, and we have a study guide available at stenhouse.com. I'll leave the link for you in the description. That wraps up another episode of Teacher's Corner. Check out our website at stenhouse.com, where you can find podcast archives, book previews, study guides, and more. If you haven't done so already, we'd appreciate it if you could take 1 minute to give us a review at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever podcast player you use. It means a lot. If you've done so already, thank you. Please consider sharing this with a friend or colleague who you feel could get something from it. And as always, thank you for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Send your thoughts to us at marketing@stenhouse.com. Until next time, stay safe and healthy.